what were the types of things that someone might make a vow in pertaining to these various things? What would they? Property or land, yes, absolutely. House, even. What else? Yourself. Yeah, that's right. So persons, and even oneself, you could do that. And we also have animals that could be offered. Not always as a sacrifice, but even just in service of the tabernacle itself, whether that be kind of like a pack mule type of situation, not literally a mule, but a beast of burden that would help carry materials and so forth for the work of the tabernacle. You could do that. It is also interesting in the description of the vows that you could also do what to fulfill the vow. So you could dedicate property, you could dedicate an animal, you could dedicate your own self, but what could you also do to fulfill the vow? You could redeem it with a set amount, a set value, prescribed value of money. Let's see here. One other just kind of textual note that I found interesting, and maybe we don't always think about it in this way. It was given to the Lord. So this was this vow, whatever it is, it's dedicated to the Lord by giving it in service to the tabernacle or to the Levites, to those that it was that chosen tribe. That word for sanctuary or describing the tabernacle means apartness, holiness, sacredness, set apartness. I saw one describe it as, which I thought that was pretty good. So all of this, again, is connecting us to being set apart, being holy, and certainly the sanctuary is that. It is interesting in vowing persons, so this is verses 1 through 8 of Leviticus 27. There are fixed amounts for a person that you might redeem, and that's based on age. It's based on the sex of the person, whether they're male or female, and that would vary throughout. And in verse 8, if the price could not be paid, if the redemption price could not be paid, what was allowed? What was allowed to happen? That's right. So the priest would come in, set the value for him, and particularly according to the ability of him who vowed. I think this is something we should continue, wherever we see this, just continue to note. You hear people that say the old law was so oppressive, it was so vindictive, God was such an angry God. Throughout the old law, we see God being a compassionate God, a merciful God, where He recognizes, okay, this person he is dedicated to me. He wants to devote whatever it might be to me, and yet he's not able to come up with the means. He's of low means, and God gives an allowance for that. Still has to fulfill the vow, by the way. Doesn't just let him off the hook, but there is some concession there. So I think that's an important thing to note. We'll talk about this here in just a moment, but what was another, so in terms of fulfilling a vow of, say, I dedicated myself, how would that typically manifest itself? What type of vow is that described as? The Nazirite vow, right. And again, we'll talk about that here in a moment. So that is someone who is very dedicated, very devoted in their service to God. They want to give all they have to God. All right, let's see. It's interesting with animals or with property. So whether that be a house or land, you could give that to the Levites. But if you say, okay, I still want to dedicate this thing to God, I want to give it to the Levites, but I also want to keep it for myself, they would have to pay an extra 20% in the redemption price to keep that. And they could do that. It's not like, I think that's kind of stipulated at the beginning. You must do this if you choose to keep it. And so then they could continue to own the animal, own the house, live in it, and so forth. One other thing to notice with that, we're talking about a person, even one's own self. We're talking about property, even one's own house. We're talking about animals. This is not someone just dedicating a cup of rice to God and saying, look at me, I'm so devoted. This would require quite a bit of sacrifice. All the things that are described, these aren't small things that are given. And they're also willing sacrifices. So this is an incredible thing that someone might do. One other thing I'll note on this, in Numbers chapter 30, we also see that vows could be given to afflict one's soul. And so that's basically the description of voluntary fasting, which we see happening throughout the Old Testament and on into the New Testament even, once the new covenant is established. All right, let's see. So one other thing I wanted to note in, I think it's, Numbers 30. There's some peculiar, at least to our modern ears, some peculiar things that are talked about here in this chapter. And it's the discussion, basically, if a wife of a household, the mother of a household, makes a vow, what could the husband then do in response to that? Yeah, he could make it void, basically. And I think the text infers this also. It would have to happen on the day that it happens. He couldn't wait, 30 days down the road and say, well, this is not going exactly how I thought it would. I'm going to, I'd like my money back or whatever, or my animals, all those things. But he could also go ahead and say, no, that's right. We are going to dedicate that and back that up. What's being described here in Numbers 30 is authority, is it not? It's an authority structure. We don't like to talk about that in our modern culture. It sounds pretty strange. But we have situations, it's not just husband and wife, but father and daughter. Widows even are talked about here. But if basically what's being described, if a woman made a vow without the husband knowing, that would affect the household in some great way. They would be without animals. They would be without a home. They would be without land without money. So that's a pretty big deal. And the head of the household, the man of the household, stops with him. And he's the one leading the household in that way. And so if he agrees to it, again, no take-backs, right? Has to continue on with it. The household itself, and I think that's the key idea. The whole household is involved in this vow, in this devotion, in this dedication, in this vow. And so it paints a really powerful picture, I think, when we look at that. Any other comments on that particular question, that section?
Well, also in Numbers 30 talks about she makes a thoughtless utterance of her lips, which is what the husband
Yes.
avoids. And I
Yeah.
think that you can see that happening, especially, sorry, but you can see that happening with women.
Yeah.
Sometimes our thoughts are bigger than our abilities.
Yeah, and of course it can happen with men also, but yeah, no, I think there maybe is a tendency there, and it's not just there in Numbers 30, but rash vows in general. The Proverbs talk about this. Rash vows are talked against, warned against. Do not make a rash vow and enter into something that you're not going to be able to pay. You're not going to be able to do good on. And so the husband would be right to say, no, we can't handle this. So no, we're not going to go forward in that. And that would be appropriate. Anything else on that? Sir?
To that point, in Ecclesiastes 5, like one of the verses you're referring to, better to not vow than to vow not paid.
Yeah.
Solomon there calls it the sacrifice of a fool.
Mm.
You know, the good
Yeah.
intentions.
Yeah.
But religion that's all about promises and not about delivering is the sacrifice of a fool.
Mm-hmm.
And it does not please God.
Right.
If it's shallow, if it's
Yeah.
false, it doesn't please God.
Yeah. I don't think this is exactly a one-to-one parallel, but we go to the book of Acts with Ananias and Sapphira, and there's some similarities there, I think, and maybe they had good intentions. Maybe we can paint it in that light, because they did sell their land, and they said, we're selling it for this much. We're giving all that we made from that, but they only gave half. So the motivations weren't exactly where they needed to be. So all of that needs to be in line when giving a vow. All right, question number 3 then. What things, so these are a lot of things you could vow. What things could not be vowed? What were some of those things that were forbidden?
Chose not to redeem it.
Say it one more time. Say that one more time. What'd you say?
Oh, if the owner
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to redeem it.
Right. If the owner didn't want to redeem it, right. What else?
Things that were already devoted to the Lord.
Right. So that would manifest itself in a lot of ways, wouldn't it? Whether that was an animal for sacrifice, this is devoted as a burnt offering or a sin offering or whatever it might be. It's like, no, I want to do this instead. Keep it alive and pay the amount. No, you can't do that. It's already devoted to the Lord. And particularly, it would be the firstborn animals of sacrifice. So that again ties us back to the final plague in Egypt, back in Exodus 13. So it could be of course, the firstborn of the unclean could not be offered, but if it was devoted in some way, could be brought home. They would pay 1/5 of that assigned value, and that would be that. All right, let's see. Let's go over, or I'll just make this a passing reference. When we come to the book of Joshua, what is a major thing? Hands off. This is devoted to me, God. This is devoted to the Lord. What could they not take of to then even offer to God once they entered the promised land? Do you remember? Jericho. Anything within the city, they could not. They could not use that to say, well, it's for God. No, this is all the spoil. All of it is for. And you remember Achan ignored that, took some of the spoil, and it caused others to be killed, and it caused even himself and his whole family to be killed. And then also, no one devoted to destruction, so no one that was devoted to death could be redeemed. They were to be put to death also. That divine order had to be carried out. And then tithing. You could not take the tithe. This is verses 30 through 37 there in Leviticus. Or I think that's, I may have my reference off there. Regardless, this would be 1/10 of all the increase that belonged to the Lord. And it's even interesting, I had never noticed this particular detail. Even every 10th animal that passed under the shepherd's rod, so you can imagine the shepherd that's standing out there with rod extended, every 10th animal that went under his rod, that is to be dedicated to the Lord. And he could not say, well, I was going to save that one for me, because that's one of my good ones. That's the Lord's. You can't pick and choose, swap the good for the bad, and so forth. No substitutions. All right, anything else there on this question here? All right, and well, it looks like okay, I just didn't advance yet. Sorry about that. So question 4 here. This is now the Nazirite vow. What were just quickly, we've I've talked about this already. What were the requirements of the Nazirite vow? what were the three things that we typically associate with the Nazirite vow?
Couldn't cut their hair?
Yes, could not cut their hair. That would be, again, for a certain period of time. It might be 30 days, it might be a few months, whatever it might be. They would get to select that time. What else? What else were they?
No product of the grape.
No, yes. Maybe often we think, well, they just couldn't drink any wine. It's nothing to do with the grape. Skin, fruit, juice, any product of the grape, they could not consume. Then there's one more thing. I think maybe I heard it. Yes, do not go near a dead body. That would be a human or an animal. Just looking at, I'll throw those up on the screen. Just looking at the name Nazirite, it means, notice again, to be separated or consecrated for special service to God. So like the sanctuary was set apart for special service to God, like the Levites were set apart for special service to God, and the priests, and there's a lot of repetition here, isn't there? Just a few other places that this particular word for Nazirite is used in Scripture. I thought it might be good for us to look at these. Going back to Genesis, in Genesis 49 and verse 26, this is a description of Joseph in the blessings that his father was giving out to all of the sons there towards the end of his life. Genesis 49 and verse 26, the blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestors up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of him who was separate. That's our word there. Who was separate from his brothers. Over in Deuteronomy then, this is a similar, just almost a retelling of what's given there in Genesis by Moses. Here in Deuteronomy 33 and verse 16. Deuteronomy 33:16. He says, with the precious things of the earth and its fullness and the favor of him who dwelt in the bush, let the blessing come on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brothers. So there is obviously this idea with Joseph where he was, in many ways, head and shoulders above the rest of his brothers in so many ways, in terms of character, certainly where he was in Egypt at this point. But he also got that double portion, you remember, that Jacob gave to his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And we're going to see that bear out here in just a little bit, probably not tonight, but in the book of Numbers, we'll see some of that also. One other thing with the Nazirite vow, as it was with all these vows, it was also voluntary, because this would be a lot that you would be sacrificing. You would have to be intentional about the things that you do. Be sure that you don't go near a dead body. Be sure that you don't have any product of the grape. And be sure that you do not cut your hair in any way. It is also interesting, and growing up, I always thought the Nazirite vow was a lifelong vow, and I guess there's some good reason for that, because who are, and y'all talked about this already, just quickly again, who are the only three in Scripture that we know who gave themselves as Nazirites for their whole life? Who were those? Samson, John the Baptist, and the other one, maybe we forget, Samuel, right? And particularly Hannah, his mother, gave that even when she was praying to God for a son. Samson, Samuel, John the Baptist. Samson is an interesting case because on at least two counts, he would have broken his Nazirite vow. So the most, the one we think of the most probably is that his hair was cut, and he revealed that that was what he thought his strength came from, which, yes, it was, because that's what God told him not to do, but his strength came from God. But you also remember that on a couple of occasions, at least, he came in contact with dead bodies. When he killed the lion and he reached in to get the honey out, that's coming in contact with a dead body. When he took up the jawbone of a donkey and killed all those Philistines, well, he's not only picking up the carcass of an animal, but he's also killing all these men. And we don't see a lot of remorse from him there. So that's just an interesting thing to note. But we don't want to be, we need to strike a balance with Samson because he is mentioned as one of the heroes of faith in Hebrews 11. So we have to wrestle with that also. In verses, in verses 9 through 12 of Numbers 6, if the vow was interrupted in some way, so if for instance, and I think Abby brought this up recently in a conversation, especially post Numbers 13, once the people rebelled, and not to mention that there were definitely over 1 million people in this nation, if not more, very likely more, there would be a lot of people dropping dead near you, wouldn't there? That would be a almost daily occurrence, perhaps. So if that happened, what would happen with the Nazirite vow? Yeah, you'd have to start over. You can't just, he couldn't just say, well, I've got to pause here, but I'll start over, but I'll tack on the days that I've already completed. He would have to start fresh, start completely over. And then 13 through 21, when the time for the vow expired, whatever set time the individual had agreed to, he went to the door of the tent of meeting and he brought the proper sacrifices. So this would be not only over the course of the vow, but even then he has to offer these sacrifices and put in more into the vow. And so this would be someone absolutely devoted to God. Anything else there on the Nazirite vow before we move on? All right, then. Looking at question 5, so this is some application for us today. How do the things discussed in Leviticus 27 point forward to Christ in the New Testament? I'll just quickly give you the ones that, some of the ones that I thought of, that I came up with. Romans chapter 12, for instance, verses 1 through 2. This could be applied in a lot of different ways, I suppose. But certainly it applies here. We are to devote our lives as living sacrifices, as Paul lays out there in that chapter, holy and acceptable to the Lord, which is our reasonable service. We also see that Christ voluntarily, willingly offered himself as a fulfillment of God's will, and he did that on our behalf. And he certainly was devoted to God. 1 Corinthians 6, 19 through 20, we have been bought with a price. We are not our own. Our very lives belong to God. All that we say, all that we do, all that we are belongs to God. We've already mentioned Acts 5 and maybe some connections with Ananias and Sapphira there. I won't retread that ground. But then also James 1:17, all good things come from God. But then also 1 Peter 4:10, that all of the things that could be offered to God, and this is important, because you think about the animals, the houses they were going to be living in, the land that they would be farming, and even their own selves, and even their household. These were already gifts from God. They're not giving anything back to God that wasn't already his, right? And so that's maybe something to think about. We are simply returning what was given to us in the first place, the blessings that God has given. Does anyone else have any other passages that come to mind in terms of the fulfillments here, or any other comments before we move into the next lesson?
I guess it may not be exactly applicable, but a vow being a solemn promise, the ultimate examples of that is God making promises to us. And he keeps all those promises.
Yeah.
And of course, you touched upon Christ being the one that is the payment, the redeeming for our sins.
Yes. Yeah.
It's pretty serious. And we learn from his seriousness here, that he means business when he gives us his promise too.
Right. And I think we can certainly see a reflection of that with God's promises. God keeps every single one of his promises, so if you make a vow, you better keep it. That is binding, certainly. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Just a note, when we think about the Nazirite vow, don't you think about that passage in Amos? Amos is doing his work, trying to revive faith in God during the days of Jeroboam. And he said, the Lord says through it, I give you young men to be prophets and Nazirites. And he said, you give the Nazirites wine to drink and tell the prophets to hush. They had a role, in God's work. But, in an age that didn't want to hear it, wasn't interested in God. It's a really sad commentary on the times.
Yeah. It is an incredibly sad commentary. Yeah, you read so many of the prophets, and it really is just kind of a slap in the face to the ones that are supposed to be devoted to God the most, and yet they're some of the most deplorable. It is a sad commentary. All right, anything else before we move on here? All right, lesson 7, this is what the Waldron material describes, for lack of a better term, miscellaneous laws. So there's really all sorts of things that are talked about in this section. I'd like us to go ahead and read, and I think this is also in the material, Leviticus 18, starting with the first 5 verses. Leviticus 18, 1 through 5 says, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. According to the doings of the land of Egypt where you dwelt, you shall not do, and according to the doings of the land of Canaan where I am bringing you, you shall not do, nor shall you walk in their ordinances. You shall observe my judgments and keep my ordinances to walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. So let's just notice kind of the time that God is talking about here. You don't act like where you came from, which is Egypt. You don't act like where you're going, which is Canaan. You act like my people. You act like my chosen race, my holy nation, which is presently and on into the future. And so the last thing we might note in this particular passage in verse 5, the conclusion of all of this, if they obey, is what? What will they enjoy? If you do them, you shall what? You shall live by them. And I don't think that's just the idea of while you're living, you're doing these things, but they bring life. So we don't just do these things because God has commanded it, true enough, but there's also benefit in obeying these commands. They bring life to us. So I think that's a pretty good starting point as we move into the lesson here. The first question I had for you, at large, what category of sins does God give laws against in Leviticus 18? So let's start there, and then we'll answer the next question. So if we had to categorize the main portion of the sins talked about in Leviticus 18, how might we describe those?
Unlawful sexual relations.
Yes, sexual sins in large part is what's described here. All forms of incest were forbidden. They were forbidden to approach a woman during menstruation. Let me throw up all these here. They could not take of their neighbor's wife. They could not commit homosexuality or bestiality. And it is interesting, in the midst of all of those sexual sins that are described, we see that God tells them not to offer to Molech their own children, and that would effectively profane the name of God. Does anyone happen to remember who Molech is the god of, where that name comes from? It's not going to be the last time that we see that name, is it? Just generally, what God is Molech the god of, or who is he the god of? One of the Canaanite gods. Specifically the Ammonites, I think it is. And much later in Israel's history, Solomon, in his day, would erect a high place for Molech. Solomon would do this. Now, later in the divided kingdom, the righteous king Josiah would end up tearing down that high place. But this was a god that was a horrible thorn in the side of Israel for years and years and years. So this really gets to the second part of the question. I've already thrown it up here on the screen. They were not to partake in these things because by all these the nations have become defiled. He goes on to say. And he even says there in that section in 24, I love the language here, starting in verse 25. Do not defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all these the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you. For the land is defiled. Therefore I visit the punishment of its iniquity upon it, and the land vomits out its inhabitants. God has put aside this promised land for his people. And as such, that means that the people who are currently living there in these deplorable ways will have no place in God's kingdom. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't come into the nation. We're going to see that with Rahab, for instance, in the city of Jericho. But if you continue to do these things, the land is going to vomit you out. And God continues to say in this section, if you partake in those things, the land is also going to vomit you out. It's going to vomit you out. Yes, my chosen people even. One other interesting connection, we're talking again, trying to connect parts of the Pentateuch together. The large portion of this section deals with sexual sins. We go back to Genesis chapter 9, and in verse 20 and onward there, this is after Noah, after getting off the ark from the flood, gets drunk on his own wine that he has made from his own vineyard that he has planted, and he's laying there naked in the tent, and his son Ham comes into the tent, sees his father's nakedness, and instead of covering his shame, he goes out to his brothers and tells them. And we don't know exactly how that conversation went, but we know that it was shameful what he did. The other detail from the text in Genesis 9 is that Ham is the father of what nation? Of Canaan. So it's not exactly a picture of the things that we see here in Leviticus 18, but I think that we can say Ham paved the way for these things, didn't he? And what's also interesting in Leviticus 18 is God is saying, don't act like Canaan. Don't act like your forefather Ham. Act instead like your forefather Shem. That's not, the text doesn't bear this out in Leviticus 18, but he says, you are my people. You act like my people. So you act like Shem, who was a forefather of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob. The line of the Messiah. You act like God has chosen you, and not like these other nations. Anything else there on that that particular section?
Like these people, they weren't like us today. They were to be different. They were not to
Yeah.
be anything like
Right.
those people.
Set apart, holy, sanctified, consecrated, all of those ideas. Yes, that's for us today also. Absolutely. Anything else? All right, we've got about 5 minutes, so let's see what we can do here. So Leviticus 20 gives the penalties associated with many of the sins mentioned in Leviticus 18, so what we've just talked about. What other sins are listed in chapter 20, and what is the penalty for all of those sins? And then there's also couple of other references that the Waldrons give that might be included in this section. So we have a lot of the sins that are mentioned in Leviticus 18. We're given the penalty for those things, but there's also other things mentioned. So what are those?
When it's turned into mediums and necromancy, spiritualism.
Yes. I think that's verse 27 of chapter 20. So this is interesting. This is one of the only things that's mentioned twice. It's mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, and then it's also mentioned in verse 27. So I forgot it was at the beginning, which is an interesting bookend to those things. So this is someone who essentially is associated with the occult, with dead. Maybe your translation says, and maybe Miss Donna, you said this, necromancer, soothsayer, someone who summons the dead, basically. But also, the text says, so not just if you're a necromancer, if you're a necromancer, there's a penalty for that, but also anyone who turns to mediums, God will set his face against them also. So you don't get involved in those things. Famously, we think of, King Saul, for instance, where he would go to the spiritist, to try and call Samuel back, and it ends up working, and she's flabbergasted by that because that probably never happens for her, in that way at least. And so God would set his face against those that would do that, and they would be cut off from the people. All right, what else? What other things are mentioned?
Anyone who curses his mother or father.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? And as it happens, I think if my notes are right, let's see here. Okay, maybe this is a little later on, but I think it is interesting that God is saying when you can think of all the deplorable things that Canaan is going to be involved in, all these sexual sins and perversions, all of these just messed up things with the gods that they would sacrifice to, and they also don't honor their father and mother. That doesn't fit, does it? God says it does. It belongs in the list. Anyone who curses father or mother. Both of these, in addition to Molech and the sexual sins, are given what penalty? Death. Death is the penalty. Even cursing father and mother is in that category. God says, you be different. And I think we'll probably have to get to, there's a little section of narrative in Leviticus 24 that applies to this section, so we'll just pause on that. But is there any other closing thought, comment? Yes, sir.
It was important enough to be carved on one of the tablets.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Connection all the way back there to Exodus. That's a great point. Yeah. So he's bringing that up again. Very good. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you all so much. If you could continue to look over Lesson 7, Lesson 8, we'll get into that on Sunday. Thank you.